Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
What explains the enormous inequality we see in the world today? Why is it that some countries are so much poorer than other countries? And at some level, at some proximate level, we understand very well why that is. We understand that rich countries have been much more successful at innovating and adopting technology, at investing in their people, in education systems, what economists call human capital, in physical capital accumulation. But just why is it that some parts of the world are much better at accumulating capital and creating new technology and adopting technology and investing in education and the skills of their workers? Just think about the Americas. If you think about differences within the Americas between the poorest and the richest country, those are enormous differences. So differences in income per capita between a poor country like Paraguay or Honduras and the United States would be 20-fold difference in income per capita. And what's interesting about the incomes within the Americas is if you rank the countries from the sort of the richest to the poorest today, so you start with the United States and Canada, you have Chile or Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, you get down to Bolivia, Paraguay, Guyana, and if you have that ranking, you went back 50 years, almost identical. Go back 100 years, almost identical. Go back 150 years, you're on much more treacherous ground in terms of the numbers, but probably the ranking is very similar. If you go back to the conquest of the Americas, the conquest of Mexico, for example, which takes place after 1519, what happens finally after a 2-year struggle, Cortés and his conquistadors conquer the empire of the Aztecs, of the Mexicas? The first thing they do is they get all the indigenous people and they divide them up between the conquistadors using an institution called the encomienda. Encomienda was a sort of a contract which determined what the conquistador could extract from these people. So the Spanish colonial empire focused very soon on the exploitation of indigenous people, all sorts of systems designed to extract labor, income, work, assets from the indigenous people. And so what developed in Latin America was this very hierarchical, sort of authoritarian society based on the kind of exploitation of the vast mass of indigenous people by this Spanish who came. What happened in North America? Well, they had a model of how to run a colony in the Americas, how to create a colonial society. The first thing you did was you captured the Indian chief, the local Indian chief. And once you captured the local Indian chief, the indigenous people came, they brought food, you could start coercing them, and you had this beautiful society just like the Spanish had. So they had this model of Cortés and Pizarro in mind. They struggled early on to do this. It's very fascinating, the history of the Virginia Company, because the first few years, they came there, they thought, this is the type of society we're going to have, so no one bothered working. As a result, 2/3 of them starved to death in the first couple of years because they didn't have any food. They wouldn't grow food. I mean, that's not how you colonize in the Americas. You didn't work for yourself and grow food. You exploited the indigenous people. But that was a model that just didn't work. So this struggle went on for about 12 years. And then the Virginia Company, which was basically a profit-making enterprise, wasn't making any money, gave up on this model of exploiting the indigenous people. So in 1619, they gave up. And they freed everyone from their contracts. They gave everyone 50 acres of land. And they gave them political rights as well. So they created a legislative assembly. Coercing people didn't work. So they thought, we have to create incentives for these people to work. We have to create economic incentives, so we have to give them land and access to land. And we have to back that up by giving them political rights. That's the story of why the origin, the roots of why North American society is so different from Latin American society. The reason that Latin American societies today are the most unequal places in the world has its origin in the way that colonial society was set up, the way that this very hierarchical, unequal society based on the exploitation of indigenous people. So if you look at the way the economy of colonial Latin America was organized, and that's something that's lasted right up to the present. Actually, you know, in the case of Bolivia, for example, there were specific forced labor institutions that date back to the colonial period that were only abolished in the revolution in 1952. In Guatemala, the same is true right up until 1945. So some of these very specific things persisted over time. But even though many of the specific things did not persist, the type of society that was created persisted. So these types of forced labor and encomienda contrast enormously the type of economic institutions that emerged in the United States. Now, that sort of dichotomy, and I'm going to create this dichotomy between kind of extractive institutions, as in colonial Latin America, the terminology comes from, you know, those things were designed to extract income and resources from some people and transfer them to other people, as opposed to inclusive institutions. In the United States, if you want to have sustained economic progress in society, if you want to have technological change, if you want to have capital accumulation, you need to have inclusive economic institutions. Why is that? Because talent and ability is widely spread in society. If you look at the 19th century and you look at, say, patenting, you look at who patented inventions, you see people came from all over the place. They were unskilled people, farmers, businessmen, professional, all over the social scale. They were not just elites. You need to harness, you need to have a set of economic institutions that can harness that talent, that creativity in society. In a very oligarchic system where there's slavery or serfdom or forced labor, then you can't harness that talent. But where do those things come from? And the basic answer to that question is politics, okay? That the society of Latin America was set up the way it was because some small group of people were able to politically dominate the rest. Apartheid South Africa was a sort of dictatorship of 20% of the people, those are the white people, over the other 80% of the population, primarily black, also Indians and Cape-coloured people. In South Africa, they had a thing called the colour bar. And the colour bar was essentially a list of an enormous number of professions that only white people were able to undertake. No black person could undertake any of those professions. Why was that? To remove competition in the labour market and keep white wages high. So this was a system of labour market institutions, access to land, access to education, that was designed to extract from 80% of the population to the benefit of 20%. What kept that system in power was the fact that the white people were the only people who had political power. As soon as the system changed in 1994, that system of economic institutions was completely untenable because the 80% of people had political voice, and you couldn't have a colour bar. You couldn't have laws forbidding black people to open businesses in 87% of the economy. So politics is crucial for underpinning these institutions. And there's a synergy between what we call extractive political institutions and extractive economic institutions. It's the concentration of political power which drives an extractive economy. And inclusive political institutions are political institutions that spread power broadly in society. What's also important for having political institutions that generate good economic institutions in society, inclusive economic institutions, is a sufficient amount of what we call political centralization. And if you read about Somali society, it's a case where, in some sense, political power is very equally distributed, at least amongst men in traditional Somali society. Men got together, adult men got together, and essentially tried to reach a consensus about what to do, where to move, where to farm, where to graze, who to attack. So this was a situation where, in some sense, political power was very equally distributed. But that led to a pretty chaotic situation because there was no state in traditional Somali society. There was never a process of political centralization. And without political centralization, you can't really have economic development because you can't have order, essentially, and you can't get key public goods provided. So inclusive political institutions tend to lead to inclusive economic institutions. Extractive political institutions tend to lead to extractive economic institutions. So how do you explain world inequality today? Well, it's because poor countries tend to have extractive political and extractive economic institutions. You know, some people say, oh, this is a very pessimistic view, you know, because we see the problems of society, the institutions of society as being very kind of deeply rooted in history. But I actually think it's not pessimistic. You know, my own view is the last 5 years I've been doing a lot of work in Sierra Leone in West Africa. And my personal view is that there's no reason why Sierra Leone should not be an economically successful, prosperous place where people live as long as in Britain, and they're as healthy, and they have access to education and schools and infrastructure and economic opportunities, and just like we do. The problem in Sierra Leone is just that it's been caught in this very sort of vicious institutional circle historically. And it needs to change that. It needs to change its institutions. What does foreign aid do in this context? Well, throwing money at this problem may help poor people, but obviously it doesn't change the fundamental institutional problems of a society. So from a policy perspective, the bottom line of this analysis is if you want to solve these problems, you have to solve the way the political system works in these societies, and you have to try to change political institutions, make the central state stronger, spread political power more broadly in society, and from that these economic changes will flow. But as I always say to my friends at the World Bank, if this problem was easy, you'd have been out of a job 30 or 40 years ago. And the reason you're not is because this is not easy.
China's quite a big striking phenomenon at the moment. You've got this thesis that success in development depends upon inclusive economic institutions, which in turn depends upon inclusive political institutions. Has China got inclusive political institutions?
There's so many myths, it seems, about Chinese economic growth in the last 30 years. And the first myth is that this is something to do with the wonderful nature of the Chinese Communist Party, when actually the story is that economic growth that's taken place in China since 1978 is not due to the Communist Party, it's in spite of the Communist Party. It was the withdrawal of the Communist Party from an attempt to sort of control every single element of society that led to this economic development. First in agriculture, the introduction of incentives in agriculture, which led to enormous boom in productivity, the withdrawal from the economy, from controlling labor markets, from controlling firms to allow people to start businesses and move where they want to. So I sort of see, that the whole success of China has been, using our terminology, a move from having very extractive economic institutions to having much more inclusive economic institutions. Now, of course, you're right that at the same time, the political system, has stayed very extractive. The Communist Party wants to stay in power, and it organizes itself to stay in power. It's just unsustainable, this situation, and it will crash for one of several reasons.
Basically, it comes down to domestic political struggle, that there's an irreducible central role for domestic political struggle, and that therefore the role of the external is peripheral in a sense, but that doesn't mean it's zero.
Yeah.
The easy one to knock down is just throwing money at them or invading them. What's in between the ground of just throwing money and just invading that might be a little bit more effective?
You go to the World Bank, everyone talks about empowerment. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about the problem, in the sense that, what really needs to happen for a political change is that, people who are disempowered need to be empowered. If you think about the transition in South Africa from apartheid, what sounded the death knell of apartheid? Well, there were sanctions and things like that, but it was really African society in the 1970s empowering, getting organized after Soweto and these other things, forming unions, so getting organized collectively to contest the power of the regime. That's what really knocked off apartheid. In fact, they were already, reforming before sanctions came in the mid-1980s. So that process of empowerment, it seems to me, is trying to empower people politically in terms of making them aware of their rights and demanding things collectively. That seems to be to us the right way to think. I'm not sure that we as scholars or people at the World Bank or DFID really sort of understand how to do that, how to empower people. But I think that's the right way to think about policy. You need to change the political equilibrium in society, and that's one way of trying to do it, it seems.